Right. The Sabbath Sunday question, right? Now, like I said, there are only 8 texts in the New Testament that mention the first day of the week. Okay. So if we are going to find evidence for Sunday observance, it must be in one of those 8 texts, right? Now, in our study today, we will review these texts, find that there is no scriptural evidence that Sabbath was changed to Sunday in these 8 texts that are Protestant brothers and sisters used to say that Sabbath was changed from Saturday to Sunday. Okay, so let's go. Now, before, just to as an introduction, now the great Aristotle lived around the year 350 BC, right? Besides being a renowned philosopher, he was also a naturalist. Okay, so he defined a spider as a small insect that had 6 legs. Okay, for 2000 years, people accepted his definition without question that the spider had 6 legs. After all, who would question the authority of the great Aristotle? Then in the latter half of the 18th century, John Baptist Lamarck, I hope I got his name right, decided to examine the spider for himself. Okay, and lo and behold, he discovered that the spider is not an insect. It is an anakin, right? And that it actually has 8 legs. Now, we can learn several lessons from this story. One is, for over 2000 years, people had passed on an erroneous tradition based on the opinion of a so-called expert. This proves that depending on statements of authority cannot be the test of truth. We must examine things for ourselves, like Jean-Paul Lamarck did. He examined the spider and found that he didn't have 6 legs, he had 8 legs. Now, the passing of time does not make error truth, okay, or truth error. The spider did not grow 2 extra legs after Aristotle provided his definition. The spider already had 8 legs before, right? Now, the third is the belief of the majority does not make error into truth, right? Does not make error the truth, right? So, as in our previous studies, we noticed that the faithful Christians who fled in AD 70 kept the 7th-day Sabbath. Jesus himself told them to pray that their flight is not in winter nor on the Sabbath, right? Matthew 24:20 tells us that. Now, this proves that Jesus did not nail the Sabbath to the cross when he died, because he's telling the Christians in AD 70, he died in AD 31, not pray that it will not be on the Sabbath. However, most Christians today claim that Sabbath observance was for the Jews and that Sunday is the new day of the Christian Sabbath. Now, in spite of this, many Christians today claim that this is the new Sabbath for the Christian. This makes it necessary for us to consider what the New Testament says about the Sabbath and Sunday. We need to examine it for ourselves, find out from the Bible, see whether what they say is correct. And if it is not correct, then we say that the 7th day is still the Sabbath, right? So that's what we are going to do today, right? We are going to prove from scripture that the Sabbath was not changed to Sunday. Right. First, let's notice some introductory information. There are only 8 texts in the New Testament that mention the first day of the week. Okay. So if we are going to find evidence of Sunday observance, it has to be one of those 8 texts, at least one of those 8 texts, right? Now, the word Sunday never appears in the New Testament. Right? Sunday never appears in the New Testament. Although the Romans did use the name Dia Solis, or the day of the sun, to refer to the first day of the week. The Bible numbers the first 6 days of the week, but does not give them names. Only the seventh day has a number and a name in the Bible. The name is Sabbath or Sabbath. And incidentally, the Brazilians follow the Bible pattern by numbering the days from Monday to Friday and name only 2 of them, Domingo or Sábado, right? So they call Saturday Sabbath, right? Now, Latin was, as we all know, was the language of the Romans. Although the Bible numbers the days, the pagan Romans gave the days planetary names in honor of their god. Now, here are the names that the Romans gave to the days of the week. Dies Solis is Sunday. Dies Lunae is Monday. Dies Martis is Mars, in honor of Mars. So Sun, Moon, Mars is Tuesday. Dies Mercury is Mercury, that's Wednesday. Dies Lovi or Jovi or Zeus is Thursday. Dies Veneris is Venus, that's Friday. And Dies Saturni is Sabbath or Saturday Sabbath according to the Bible. So they gave the days of the weeks the names according to their sun god, right? So they were the planets: Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jovi, Venus, and Saturn. Okay, so that's how they named it. Now let's go to the 8 references that we are going to study in detail, right? That these 8 references are to the first day of the week in the New Testament. And from these 8 texts, the 8 references, we are going to ask them 4 questions. Does the text state that the first day or Sunday is the Lord's day? Okay, because the Christians today say that Sunday is the Lord's day. So does the text say, very clearly say, that Sunday is the Lord's day? Does the text tell us that the first day of the week, Sunday, is holy? Does the text tell us that we are supposed to go to church on the first day? Does any text tell us that we are to keep Sunday in honor of the resurrection of Christ? So we're going to ask those 4 questions from these 8 texts that we are going to study. And then at the end of a study, we will consider Revelation 1:10, a verse that Christians have used as proof text for the observance of Sunday as the day of rest, right? So we are technically going to study 9 texts. So let's get into it. The first text is found in Matthew 28:1. Let's read that.
Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb.
Okay, now we are going to ask the questions, remember? So this text does not say that the first day of the week is the Lord's day. There is no reference there. Then it does not say that we must keep it holy, okay? That we are supposed to attend church on this day, or that we must keep it in honor of the resurrection of Christ, right? Furthermore, the text clearly states that Sunday is not the Sabbath because it tells us that Jesus resurrected after the Sabbath, right? Now, after the Sabbath. So Sunday is not the Sabbath. The text very clearly tells us Sunday is not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the 7th day, while Jesus rested on the in the tomb on the 7th day, he resurrected on the first day, right? Now, some calendars today in various parts of the world muddy the water, right? By making Monday the first day of the week, right? Or the first day of the working week. So they muddy it up a little bit. And then when you do that, then Sunday becomes the 7th day. Now, this is a crafty way of making people think that Sunday is the 7th day of the week. So the first text, remember, the first text gives us no evidence that Sunday is the Lord's day, that we are to keep it holy, and that we are supposed to go to church, or that we are to honor it because Jesus resurrected on that day. It says, simply says, now after the Sabbath. So obviously the Sabbath was Saturday, and then it refers to the first day of the week and dawn, right? So it doesn't give any indication. Let's move on to the second text. Mark 16, 1 and 2.
Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen.
Okay, so now once again, let's ask the 4 questions. Once again, we find this text does not say that the first day of the week is the Lord's Day. Okay, then we must, nor does it say that we must keep it holy, or that we are supposed to attend church on it, right? Nor does the text say that we are to honor it because of the resurrection. The text, I mean, you read it carefully without any problem. The text simply states that Jesus resurrected on the first day of the week after the Sabbath, right? Furthermore, the text clearly makes it clear that Sunday is not the Sabbath, because the first day is the day after the Sabbath. That's very clearly said here in this text. Now, Pope John Paul II, who was one of the charismatic popes of recent time, in one of his pastoral letters, Dies Domini, attempted to prove that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath because everything that occurred on that day, right? So he says because these things took place on that day, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. What is his argument? He says Jesus resurrected on the Sabbath. Okay? Then Jesus walked and talked to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus on Sunday. He appeared to the 11 disciples on the evening of Sunday. A week later, he appeared to the apostles again on Sunday. Then God poured out the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost on Sunday. The first proclamation of the gospel took place on Sunday. The first baptisms happened on Sunday. So he says all of these things prove, that's his line of argument, that Sunday was a special day, a significant day above other days. But then there is a question. The question is, why did Jesus resurrect on the Sunday? What people do not realize is that he resurrected on Sunday because of what he had to do on Sabbath. He resurrected on the first day because he had to rest in the tomb on the 7th or the Sabbath day. So the important day, not that the resurrection day is not important, although it's a very important day. The important day in the crucifixion, during the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ is the Sabbath. He had to rest in the tomb on the Sabbath. That would make it necessary he had to first rest in the tomb on Sabbath, so that it would make it necessary for him to resurrect on the first day of the week. Now, let's take this argument a little further. At creation, he finished on the 6th day and ceased his work on the 7th day. Genesis 2:1 tells. So you see, at creation, we are told that God, and by the way, when it says God, it's talking about Christ, because Christ is the one who was doing the creating. John 1:1-3 tells us that. Now, Jesus finished his work on the 6th day. He ceased his work on the 7th day. So it says he finished the 6th day and ceased on the 7th day. Ceased means he stopped his creation on the 7th day. Ceased from creating, right? So then he worked 6 days and he ceased. He rested on the Sabbath day on creation. Then we find at redemption, okay? And when he finished creation, he said, it is finished and it is good. And then he rested on the Saturday. Now at creation, he said, it is finished, John 19:31, and ceased, rested in the tomb on Sabbath. He ceased his work of redemption, his salvation, his work of taking a place. He ceased that work and he rested on the Sabbath. So at redemption, the same thing occurred. Jesus said it is finished on the cross, and then he ceased by resting in the tomb on the Sabbath so that he could resurrect on Sunday morning. Then at the restoration, he will recreate the world in 6 days. This is the new world that we are going to have, and say it is done, like he did on resurrection, during the resurrection week now, and then he will cease on the seventh day. Now, when God restores all things, he creates a new heaven and a new earth. He will say, according to Revelation 21:6, it is done. The plan of salvation is done. Restoration is done. He has given us a new heaven and a new earth. And then Isaiah 66 tells us that God's people will rest on the seventh day as a sign of a completed new creation. Okay? So the important day is not that Jesus had to resurrect on Sunday, or because he was saying that Sunday is going to be the new day of rest. No, Jesus had to rest in the tomb on the Sabbath. By the way, he rested a full 24 hours in the tomb on Sabbath. That would make it necessary for him to resurrect on the Sunday morning. Okay? So the fact that Jesus rested tells us that he ceased from his labors during creation week, during the redemption week, and then we are told during the restoration in the new earth, he will work 6 days and we will all rest with him on the seventh day. Now let's move on to text number 3. So we have in these 2 texts that we have read so far, there is no reference to that it's holy, no reference that Sabbath was changed there. It is just stating that Jesus rose on the first day after the Sabbath. Now let's go to text number 3, Mark 16:9.
Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons.
Okay, so once again, let's analyze this text. We ask the 4 questions of it. The text does not say that the first day of the week is the Lord's day, okay? Nor that we must keep it holy, or that we are supposed to attend church on the first day, or that we are to keep it in honor of the resurrection. The text simply states that Jesus resurrected on the first day of the week. Again, it tells us that Jesus resurrected the day after the Sabbath. Okay? How much more emphasis could the Bible give us, right? So what the text does tell us is that Sunday is the day after the Sabbath. Sunday is the first day of the week, whereas Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. Now, sometimes Christians use a psychological argument in favor of Sunday. Okay? They say Sabbath was a sad day for the disciples because Jesus had died in the tomb. However, Sunday was a day of joy and victory because Jesus resurrected. Therefore, we Christians keep the joyful and victorious day. Now, if you listen to that argument carefully, you will find that that is based on human reasoning and logic. And that reasoning and logic is contradictory to the Bible. First, there was no reason why the disciples should have been sad on that Saturday if they had been listening to what Jesus had said. Jesus had told them multiple times that he was going to die and resurrect on the 3rd day. One reference is Matthew 16:21. He told them that he was going to Jerusalem, he was going to suffer at the hands of the religious leaders, and he was going to resurrect on the 3rd day. If they had only paid a little bit of attention, they wouldn't have been sad that Saturday. Right? If they had listened to Jesus, the Sabbath would have been a day of joyous expectation because they would have waited for Sunday morning for Jesus to resurrect, right? Where they could say that this is the day of rest. Jesus has accomplished his work of redemption, and tomorrow he will resurrect from the grave, and it would be a day of joyous expectation, right? It wasn't Christ's fault that the Sabbath was a sad day, because he had told them that he was going to resurrect on the 3rd day. He had told them that clearly. Now, the second most devastating to this argument that has no basis is that on Sunday evening, the disciples were still sad. Sunday morning they were sad. Sunday evening they were sad because they didn't believe that Jesus was resurrected, right? So let's notice Mark 16, let's read 19 to 30. So when they say that Sunday was a joyous day of rejoicing and it was joyous, it is not biblically correct, because let's read Mark 16 to 13. This is when Jesus, it also talks about Jesus meeting what we read just now, and also on his walk with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. Let's read that.
Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either.
Oh, okay. So clearly the Bible is telling us that on the morning of the resurrection morning, when Mary went and told them, they were still weeping and mourning, and they refused to believe her, that Jesus had resurrected. Then the evening when the 2 disciples, Cleophas and the other disciple, went and told them that they had met Jesus, they still didn't believe. So Sunday evening, I said, they were sad, right? So how could Sunday be a joyful, happy day if the disciples didn't even believe that Jesus has resurrected? So clearly this argument is based on psychology. It's not based on scripture, right? We in hindsight know that that was the resurrection morning, but the disciples didn't. They were hiding from the Jews in that room, and they were sad and frightened and weeping because their master had died. So that argument also holds no water. Let's go to the 4th one, John 21 and 2.
Now the first day.
Go ahead, Auntie.
Now the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciples whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him."
So this is the 4th one, right? Now, here's some important points about these 2 particular verses that we have just read. Once again, it does not say that Sunday is the Lord's Day. We are not told that it is a memorial for the resurrection. We are not told that Sunday is holy, and we are not told that Sunday, we are supposed to go to church on Sunday, right? Asking those 4 questions. So none of these things are mentioned in this text, right? If you analyze it carefully, right? Or even just briefly, if you can analyze it, that's not there. Now, here's an important point that we need to know. Now, according to scholars, the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation were written by the same person, right? At about the same time, right? The end of the 1st century, around the year 95 AD, right? When John wrote the Gospel of John and Revelation, and 1st and 2nd and 3rd John as well. By this time, more than 60 years had passed since the resurrection. Right now, we are reading John. John was written 60 years after Christ's resurrection. And in spite of the fact that John is writing this, he simply says that Jesus resurrected on the 1st day of the week, and that they didn't find him because he wasn't around, because he had resurrected. Now, if Sunday was the day of rest after 60 years had passed, it would have been a golden opportunity for John to say, now we are supposed to keep Sunday holy, or we are supposed to commemorate it in honor of the resurrection. It is the day we are supposed to go to church. But it doesn't say it, right? So any of those things, he doesn't say any of those things 60 years after the resurrection of Christ. He simply states that Jesus resurrected on the 1st day of the week, right? Now, in fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their books also 30 years after the resurrection, and none of them singled out the 1st day of the week as a special day, but they simply tell us that Jesus resurrected on the 1st day of the week. So there is no indication given in these 4 scriptural passages that Sunday is holy. Sunday is supposed to be commemorated because of the resurrection, and that we are supposed to go to church on Sunday. Right? So far 4. So we have 4 more to go. Let's go to text number 5. Luke 24, 1 to 3.
Now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. But they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Then they went in and did not find the body of the Lord Jesus.
Okay, now let's ask the 4th question from this text as well. We find that the text does not say that the first day of the week is the Lord's Day, that we are to keep it holy, that we are supposed to attend church on it, or that we are to keep it in honor of the resurrection. Okay? The text simply states that Jesus resurrected on the first day of the week. Furthermore, the text tells us that Jesus resurrected the day after the Sabbath. So all 5 texts that we have read now have told us that the Sabbath was Saturday and Jesus resurrected on the day after, which was Sunday, the first day of the week, because the Bible doesn't name the days of the week apart from the Sabbath, and Friday is called preparation, right? So Sunday is not the Sabbath, but rather the day after the Sabbath. So as we examine the sequences of the days in Luke 23, 50 to 24 and 24:1, we clearly see that Jesus died on Friday, the 6th day, or the Bible calls it the preparation day, rested in the tomb on Sabbath, which is the 7th day, and resurrected on what we today call Sunday, the first day, right? Therefore, Sunday cannot be the Sabbath from Scripture. Let's read Luke 23, 54 to Luke 24, verse 2.
That day was preparation, and the Sabbath drew near, and the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Now, first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared, but they found the stone rolled away from the tomb.
Okay, right? Now, which commandment are they referring to here? Obviously, it's the 4th commandment, which says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, right? So Luke wrote these verses about 30 years after Jesus resurrected, and it clearly states that the women rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment, the 4th commandment. This proves that believers kept the Sabbath after Christ died. Therefore, Christ did not abolish the Sabbath at the cross, like they say, right? The Sabbath was not abolished at the cross. Now, the Jewish festivals predicted Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection 1,400 years before the event occurred. Leviticus 23, 4 to 11, right? Mentions 3 spring feasts, the Passover, the unleavened bread, and the first fruits. Jesus fulfilled all 3 right on time, right? He died on the 14th day of Nisan, remained in the tomb on the 15th, and resurrected on the 16th day of Nisan. Now, Christians celebrate the events of the Holy Week once a year. Right now, we are in the Lent season of this year, so-called Lent season. These include the entrance of Jesus to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, right? His agony in Gethsemane on Holy Thursday. His death on Good Friday, right? Why then do Christians celebrate Resurrection Sunday every week? The question is, why then do Christians celebrate Resurrection Sunday in every week instead of once a year, like the rest of the days of the Holy Week? The Jews observe these festivals once a year, including first fruits that pointed to the resurrection of Jesus, right? It is ironic that Christians observe Holy Week that the Bible never commands, and they refuse to keep the Sabbath that the Bible clearly commands. And in their Holy Week, there is no mention of the Sabbath. There is no Sabbath in that Holy Week of theirs. They have Holy Thursday, they have Monday, Wednesday, Palm Sunday, then they have Good Friday, but Sabbath is not mentioned, and then they have Resurrection Sunday. Okay? So when it comes to the resurrection of Christ, they say, well, you have to keep that every week. The simple fact is the Bible does not tell us to do that. So they don't keep Good Friday every week, every Friday of the year. They don't keep Palm Sunday every Sunday, every Sunday of the year. They don't keep, what is that, what do they call that, Holy Thursday every Friday, every Thursday of the year. But they keep Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, every Sunday of the year. Bible doesn't tell us to do that, right? The Bible does not give any instructions or commands for us to keep any of these festivals for that matter. And certainly not worship on Sunday, as we have seen so far in the text. Now let's move on to text number 6. Now this text describes an event that occurred on Sunday evening of the Resurrection Sunday. So this happened on Sunday evening. Remember that. Let's read John 20, verse 19.
Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be unto you."
Okay, now let's ask those 4 questions and we find the answers like this. The text does not say that the first day of the week is the Lord's Day, that we are to keep it holy, that we are supposed to attend church on it, or that we are to keep it in honor of the resurrection. The text simply states that Jesus resurrected the first day of the week. Once again, it tells us that Jesus resurrected the day after the Sabbath. So Sunday clearly is not the Sabbath according to this Bible verse. Okay? Now, many Christians use this text in an attempt to prove that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath because, now listen to the argument, right? They say the disciples gathered on the first day of the week to celebrate the resurrection. So the argument goes something like this. The disciples gathered in the upper room to celebrate communion in remembrance of the resurrection, right? And Jesus actually joined them for the celebration. So that following Jesus' example, Christians must meet every Sunday to celebrate communion in honor of Jesus' resurrection. Now you'll notice something, we notice something very interesting here. We are told the reason why the disciples gathered in the upper room, one thing is, they were not gathered to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. They're saying they were gathered there because the Bible tells us they were gathered there because they were feared the Jews. Why? Because the Jews had crucified Christ and they hid because the people knew that they were his followers and they would harm them as well. So they were in hiding. They were not there to celebrate anything, right? On that Sunday morning, on that resurrection day. The text tells us why they were gathered there in the upper room. It was not to celebrate communion or resurrection. They were just simply hiding from the Jews because they were scared because the Jews had killed Jesus, right? So there is no evidence. Now keep that in mind. Now, remember they said that they were in the room to celebrate communion. Let's unpack that, right? Now this argument has several flaws. This idea that they gathered together to celebrate communion and that Jesus actually maybe joined them for communion, it has absolutely no biblical foundation, right? The text that we just read clearly tells us why they gathered in the upper room. It was not to celebrate the resurrection, but rather because they feared the Jews, right? They were scared to death and they were in hiding, actually. Jesus could not have joined them to celebrate the communion because the day before he died, that was Thursday, he told the disciples that he would not drink it with them again until he drank it with them in his Father's kingdom, right? So then Jesus would not have been having communion on Resurrection Sunday because Jesus clearly told them that he will not drink wine or break bread with them until we get to heaven. Right? Now let's read Matthew 26, verse 29.
But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.
Yes. So
So
here
they
Jesus is saying that he will not drink the fruit, he will not have communion with them until he does it when they drink it with in heaven, right? In the Father's. So how could Jesus be gathered to celebrate communion on the evening of the resurrection if he had clearly told them on Thursday that he was not going to drink the cup again until he entered his Father's kingdom and met his disciples in the kingdom? So the Bible tells us explicitly that Jesus ate in the upper room that evening of the resurrection day, right? The Bible tells us he ate. What did he eat? Let's read Luke 24, 42 and 40.
So they gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence.
Okay, so Jesus didn't eat bread and drink wine. He ate broiled fish and honeycomb, right? Now, communion commemorates the death of Jesus, right? Not Sunday. Communion commemorates the death of Jesus, right? Now, it does not commemorate the resurrection of Christ. It commemorates the death of Jesus. So why would he celebrate communion on Sunday night to commemorate the resurrection if communion commemorates his death, right? Notice the biblical foundation found in Matthew 26, verse 28, at the communion table on Thursday night when Jesus said these words.
For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins.
So clearly, Jesus is instituting communion. He says that the grape juice represents his blood, which he's going to shed, right? So we find that Paul is a bit more explicit, gives us more details in 1 Corinthians 11:26 about the communion. Let's read that.
For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes.
Okay, so clearly here Paul is giving us a bit more explicit details of that. Celebrating communion on Sunday in honor of the resurrection of Jesus is not what Jesus said we are supposed to do. We celebrate communion to commemorate his death, and he died on Friday. He did not die on Sunday, right? Another evidence that we find that the expression that the disciples were gathered to break bread, right? Break bread. We find that the disciples broke bread every day, not only on Sunday, right? Break bread doesn't mean communion because the disciples broke bread every day. It's talking about a simple meal. Now, notice what we find in Acts 2, 44 and 46, reading that is there in the New International Version for clearer understanding.
All the believers were together, had everything in common. Every day, they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts.
Okay, so breaking bread doesn't mean you're having communion. Breaking bread is that they're having a simple meal, right? So very clearly they ate bread every day. And this is not a communion service in the upper room on the evening of the resurrection. right? So their argument that Jesus joined them for communion is all non-biblical. It is not a biblical truth. It is not found in the Bible. Okay. Now, next one is Jesus instituted communion on Thursday night of the Passion Week, right? Now, if this is the case, why did he institute it on Thursday if he wanted the Christians to celebrate it on Sunday? He would have had the excellent opportunity to institute the Lord's Supper on the Sunday night of the resurrection, but he did not do that, right? The final point is the greatest blow against this entire argument that Jesus met with the disciples to celebrate the communion is the fact, as mentioned before, the disciples did not believe even that evening that Jesus had resurrected on Sunday morning. They didn't believe it, right? Let's read Luke 24, 9 to 15, and then we'll read Mark 6, 10 to 13, which gives us more details.
Then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. And their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. Now when he rose early...
No, go ahead, Andy. Now that was the morning of the resurrection, right? That Luke 24, 9 to 10, where Mary told them. So on the morning of the resurrection, they didn't believe. Now Mark 16, 10 to 13 is the evening of the resurrection.
Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, and they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, he appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen.
Okay, so clearly in the morning they didn't believe, they were weeping and crying, the Bible tells us. And then in the evening after they didn't believe, when the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus came and told it, right? So it's interesting that the disciples were sitting at the table, and what were they doing at the table? They were not celebrating communion. They were eating their regular meal. By that time, they're crying and fear would have been, they were having their evening meal, right? When Jesus met them, that's why they gave him a boiled fish and a honeycomb, right? So it was not communion that he celebrated that Sunday, which once again is not biblically founded. Let's move on to text number 7. Now, these verses describe an offering. Now, this is another verse that they use found in Corinthians 16, 1 to 2. Now, this is an offering. These verses are describing an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem, for the poor, right? Poor and the needy. The offering was not for the local church budget, right? Romans 15, 25 to 28 tells us. Here, Paul is not speaking at all about a gathering of Christians at church on the first day of the week. Now they say because of this, right? This is another verse they refer to. Every Bible version that we may consult states that the offering was to be set aside on a weekly basis. Why would members set it aside at home if they were going to church on Sunday, right? Should they have not rather taken it to church? Not one Bible translation. We're going to read from the Bible translations to see what it says, right? Not one Bible translation version we may consult states that the offering was to be set aside. It was to be set aside on a weekly basis, right? None of the translations tell that Paul instructed the believers to take the money to church. However, some commentators insert Sunday observance into the equation. We will read that as well, right? First, let's read 1 Corinthians 16, 1-2, where they say that they gave an offering on Sunday when they went to church.
Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must also do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come.
So Paul is here telling the believers, put away something, put away your free will offering, starting from Sunday, because Sabbath they don't work, Sunday they begin to work, so they would have counted all that they earn during the rest of the week up to Friday. Saturday they wouldn't have done that. Sunday, put away what you are going to give to the poor from Sunday, beginning on Sunday. Then if you earn more, then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so that you don't have to, when I come, you don't have to find, but you would have put away something towards the poor and needy. That's what he's saying here, right? Now let's read a couple of commentaries from on this, right? The first one is from Adam Clark's, right? Adam Clark is half right. Actually says that the command is to take it to office, which is not in the verse that we just read. So we find that Adam Clark's commentary embellishes this text a little bit with human opinion. He has added his human opinion, and he hasn't given a clear commentary on what the text says. So let's read the first one.
He was to do this at the conclusion of the week when he had cast up his weekly earnings and had seen how much God had prospered his labor. He was then to bring it on the first day of the week, as is most likely to the church or assembly, that it might be put in common treasury.
Okay, now that part is he's saying, right? Now, where does the text say that? No, he's saying, okay, it must be most likely, he says, to put it into the offering towards local church budget, right? But on the other hand, the Presbyterian commentator Albert Barnes was more faithful to the text when he made his commentary on this verse. Let's read the next one.
Let him lay up at home, treasuring up as he has been prospered. The Greek phrase by himself means probably the same as at home. Let him set it apart. Let him designate a certain portion. Let him do this by himself when he is at home, when he can calmly look at the evidence of his prosperity.
He's clear, right? So now we take our salary at the end, you get it at the end of Friday, then Sabbath comes, they go to church, they don't have any budgetary financial transaction because Sabbath is holy. Then on Sunday, he will look at how much he has earned, so much for rent, so much for food, so much for this, so much for that. And then he'll put away an offering towards the poor, so that when that offering is put aside, budgeted for the poor, when Paul comes, he can take that budgeted and collected amount and give it to Paul, right? Nowhere does it say that they have to take it to church and put it in a church offering because they didn't meet on Sunday in church, right? Right, let's move on. Now let's read some Bible verses on this, right? Versions of the Bible on this. The first one is the NIV, the next is the New American Standard Bible, and the third one that is up there is the Christian Standard Version.
Now, about the collection for God's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save, as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. Now, concerning the collections for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collection when I come.
Okay, so in today's concept, we all get paid end of the month. So at the end of the month, we are supposed to do our budgets and then put aside something for the poor and needy. That is what Paul is saying. So he's saying weekly, they would have been paid weekly. So he says weekly on a Sunday when you are doing your budget for the week, put aside a small sum for the poor and needy, so that when I come, I will collect that for the poor and needy in the churches, right? Let's read a couple of more versions. Revised Standard Version, Weymouth Version, and West Version.
Now, concerning the contribution of the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that contributions need not be made when I come. On the first day of the every week, let each of you put on one side and store up at his home whatever gain has been granted to him, so that whenever I come, there may then be no collection going on. On every first day of the week, let each one of you have the habit of putting aside at home whatever he may be prospered in accumulating and keeping it in reserve, in order that when I may come, when there may not be any collections.
Okay, so what Paul is saying is, so when I come, you don't have to go looking for a contribution. You have already budgeted for it and put it away at home, right? So all the versions speak about setting aside a sum, nothing about taking it to church and putting it into the common treasury for church budget, right? Now, isn't it dishonest to use this text to prove that Sunday is holy and people were supposed to go to church on that day? The text, all the translations we read, the text is not speaking of a meeting at church, but rather private setting aside. Like when I do my budgeting for the end of the month, I put aside something for the poor and needy. So when Paul comes in a year's time, I would have collected a fair amount of money to give towards them, right? That is what he's saying. So the text is not speaking of a meeting at church, but rather private setting apart of money at home to send to the poor in Jerusalem with Paul. So that when Paul would come, he will pick up this. There would be quite a lot of collection, right? When he comes, because they had put it aside, they hadn't spent it, right? However, we might legitimately ask why Paul commanded them to set it aside on Sunday. The reason is simple, like we have discussed a little bit. The work week ended on Friday, and Sunday would give them the first opportunity to sit down and figure out how much they could set aside. So Sunday would be the day that they would be budgeting for what they had earned the previous week. They would not do this on Sabbath because it's holy and not a day to take care of our personal finances. We don't do that on Sabbath. And because no commercial transactions were to be done on Sabbath. So they didn't do that on Sabbath. They kept the Sabbath holy. They went to church. They went to the synagogue. But on Sunday, when they had free time, Sunday morning, 10 o'clock possibly after breakfast, they would have sat and they would have budgeted. And any excess, they would have, from that, they would have given a free will offering for the poor. So what does this text teach us? It does not teach us that about Sunday observance, but rather faithful stewardship. It does not suggest, but command. I give orders, so you must do, right? It's not a suggestion, but a command. Not for church operations. The money wasn't for church operations or church budget, but it was to send to the poor and needy. It was a special offering, right, for the poor and needy. It was a practice in other churches. Regularly on payday, they were to give it personally. Each one gave how much they could, right? And it was to be done privately. and the amount according to how God had blessed them, how much they had earned during the week, right? So there is no basis in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 for the observance of Sunday as the day of rest or the day to go to church and give an offering. That is not what the text says. We have reviewed it in so many different translations. It's just talking about a private offering that they put aside for Paul when he comes. Now let's talk about the 8th text, Acts 27 to 12. Now, this is an all-time favorite proof text for Sunday keepers. Let's read that.
Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together, and in a window sat a certain man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." Now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted.
So we find that this passage, we have where Paul is having a meeting on the first day of the week, the text says. They met to break bread, that is to have a meal. We discovered that break bread is every day they broke bread, that is they had a meal. He was going to depart on the very next day. From there, from there where he was. So he preached until midnight. Then he ate, and then he continued to preach until dawn. And in between all of this, poor Eutychus, who was sitting on a windowsill, fell asleep. I mean, naturally, it was past midnight. And then he falls off and he dies, and Paul resurrects. Now, verse 7 tells us that this meeting took place in the evening of the first day of the week. Right? That's what it says there. Now, the evening of the first day of the week would be what we call Saturday night. Why? Because Genesis teaches us that the dark portion of the day comes before the light portion, right? So Mark 1:32 indicates that the evening begins when the sun sets, right? So Paul would have preached on Sabbath day, then Sabbath evening, what we call Sabbath evening, biblically is the beginning of the Sunday, because when the sun sets, it begins the next day. So this means that the Sabbath begins on Friday when the sun sets, and that's the dark portion which begins, and then the Sabbath, the light portion, is when we all go to church, people go to church. So if this meeting took place on the first day of the week, in the evening of the first day of the week, since the evening comes before the morning, the dark hours come first. So it's dark first, that's the evening is first, and then the morning. And if the evening of the first day comes before the morning, it must mean that the meeting took place on what we call a Saturday night, but what the Bible calls the evening of the first day, right? So this was an out of the ordinary meeting. It was a farewell for Paul, right? Who was to travel the next day, that is Sunday morning, the daylight hours of Sunday morning. He had probably preached all day on Sabbath, and then the brethren, the people, knowing that he would leave the next morning and they wouldn't see him for some time, would have asked him to preach on Sabbath afternoon and then Sabbath evening as well, right? Saturday night, that is Sunday evening, according to Bible, the evening portion of the first day. Now, Paul would have become long-winded. He preached till midnight. He spoke to them and spoke to, because he was going, right? He didn't know when he'd see them again. And then he ate, and then poor Eutychus fell and died. And then he resurrected Eutychus. And after that, he preached till dawn, till 3, and then he traveled when day broke the next day, Sunday, the daylight hours of Sunday. So he preached during the dark hours of Sunday, which is actually what we call Saturday night. Okay, is that clear? Now, let's notice some of Paul's Sabbath customs. Now, this passage gives no justification for regular observance of the first day of the week, right? Because Paul preached on that day, right? The book of Acts repeatedly tells us that the apostles went to church on Sabbath. This was a special meeting because Paul was going on Sunday morning during daylight hours. So they asked Paul to stay and preach to them, talk to them, tell them, speak to them, right? Now, if we had Paul here, so we also would have, after church service, we would have had the potluck, and then we would have asked him to talk, and then we would have broken up at 6 o'clock, had a light dinner, then we would have asked him to talk again, and then if we were living close by, we would have had midnight snack, and then we would ask him to talk again, and that's what Paul did till 3 in the next morning, and then he went away at the next morning, right? So we find that the book of Acts repeatedly tells us that the apostles went to church on Sabbath. Paul makes it very clear which day of the week he kept all throughout the book of Acts, right? Let's notice some of these verses on which day the apostle Paul met the believers. The first one is Acts 13, 14, 42, and 44.
However, when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. So when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. Acts 16:13. And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there.
So the first one, notice the Gentiles requested Paul to preach to them on the next Sabbath, right? As Gentiles, why would they have to wait until the next Sabbath day? They had to wait as Gentiles then for the next Sabbath day for Paul to preach, right? Because Paul met on Sabbath to preach. He didn't preach to them on any day of the week, right? Paul met believers also in places that were not synagogues. Acts 16:13 says he met by the riverside, right? So he meets on the synagogue on Saturday. Then he meets them by the riverside on Saturday. So clearly, Paul met believers for Sabbath worship, right? So he clearly went to church. He worshipped on the 7th-day Sabbath. Let's read some more texts. Let's notice Sabbath. Acts 17, 2-3.
Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scripture, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ."
Okay, so it was his custom to go on the Sabbath, and it says for 3 Sabbaths he went. So his custom was to go to the synagogue on Sabbath. Okay, Acts 18:4.
And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks.
Okay, so when he met Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, right? So once again, Acts 18:4 not only tells us that his custom was to go to church on Sabbath. Then Acts 18:11, let's read that.
And he continued there a year, and 6 months, 78 Sabbaths. That is teaching the word of God among them.
Okay. So what was his custom for a year and 6 months? He met in the synagogue on Sabbath, right? Like it says 78 Sabbath. He regularly went to church on the Sabbath day, 7th day. So to ignore these clear verses and try to make it that Luke is saying that he didn't do that, that it was Sunday that he was worshipping is dishonest. It is not biblical, right? So it is worthy to note that Apostle Paul walked 35 miles to Assos the next day, which was on Sunday morning. If Sunday was the day of worship at that time, shouldn't Paul have been in church? The simple fact is that the church was not meeting on Sunday at that time. This is talking about the verse of Eutychus folly, right? So we have examined every single text in the Bible that mentions the first day of the week and have found nothing that even hints that Sunday is the day of worship for the Christians. However, there is one more text that Christians use to justify the observance of Sunday, that is Revelation 1:10. Let's read that.
I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet.
Okay, so we find Sunday keeping Christians frequently refer to Sunday as the Lord's Day. However, patristic literature, that is the literature of the early church fathers, never uses the name Lord's Day for Sunday until the end of the 2nd century in the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, right? It was at the end of the 2nd century only we found that Constantine was going to reign in 312 BC. He was bringing in these Sunday worship, right? So until then, nowhere in the early literature of the church fathers do you find the name the Lord's Day mentioned for Sunday. It is not valid to say that the use of the name at the end of the 2nd century is proof that Paul used it with the same meaning in the book of Revelation 100 years earlier, right? Now, towards the end of the 2nd century, only we found that Sunday worship was coming in. So just to say that because of that, John used it in 100 years ago is not valid. It is not an argument that holds any water. Because by the end of the 2nd century, the Sabbath was in the process, like I said, of being changed by the church to Sunday as the day of rest. Now, this is an interesting thought process. Pastor Bo says in his, when he speaks to his Christian friends of other denominations about this, he asks them 3 questions. Okay, let's go through the 3 questions and see how they answer. The first one is, first he asks, to whom, right? To whom do the light, the firmament, the vegetation, the heavenly bodies, the fish, the bird, the land animals, and human beings belong? Whom do they belong? And
God.
yes, again, Christian will say, to God, right? That's the proper answer. So then he asks the second question. He says, why do these things belong to God? Now, Auntie Cruz said they belong to God. Now, why do they belong to God?
Creation.
They answer immediately because God created them. Right? They are, of course, biblically correct because Psalms 24 tells us,
He created them.
yes, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the sea and established it upon the water. So they are correct, right? One, all this belongs to God. Why? Because he created it. Then Pastor Bo says, he asked them the third question. To whom did God make, for whom did God make all these things? So once again, without hesitation, comes the answer for all human beings. I hope you caught the gist of these questions. It's interesting. Now, once again, the Christians, if they took that to its logical conclusion, they would understand that the Sabbath is God's rest, which God created for us, right? If He created every firmament, the light, the vegetation, the heavenly bodies, the human beings, and the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath belongs to God, okay? And if everything God made on creation week is His because He made it, then Sabbath also must be His, right? Because He made it for man. So at the conclusion of the creation week. So according to Jesus, in Mark 2:27, He says, the Sabbath was made for man or not man for the Sabbath. So God created, made Sabbath, that special holy time, right? He blessed holy time for man. And He didn't make man for the Sabbath, but He made Sabbath for the man. Okay? So if we are to say that God made the first 6 days and it is He gave it to man, but that the Sabbath belongs to the Jews, isn't it a bit absurd? Right? Everything else on the creation week is for all mankind. Only the Sabbath is for the Jews. This is why the Bible refers to the Sabbath with expressions such as these. In the Bible, we find 4 references to which the Sabbath is addressed, right? That's the reason why why in the Bible the Sabbath is never called the Sabbath of the Jews or the Jewish Sabbath, because there were no Jews at creation, right? The Sabbath was created before sin. It was created before the old covenant was created at the same time, right? So it says the Sabbath of the Lord your God, right? And not once in the Old or the New Testament, not even once, do the writers refer to the Sabbath as the Jewish Sabbath or the Sabbath of the Jews. However, we find that John refers to the feast that passed away when Jesus died as the feast of the Jews, right? He refers to Jesus, he says, Jesus is the King of the Jews. Does that mean that Jesus is exclusively for the Jews and not for us? No, Jesus is the King of kings and Lord of lords of all of us, right? So now let's look at some of the feasts that are called the Jews, which ended at the cross. For example, the Jewish feasts are called the feasts of the Jews because they apply to the Jewish nation, right? It was applicable to the Jewish nation until Jesus came and fulfilled it. But not once does the Bible refer to the Sabbath as the Sabbath of the Jews or the Jewish Sabbath. That is a human invention. When they say it's a Jewish Sabbath, it is not biblical, because the Sabbath is always referred to the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths, Jesus says. God refers to it as my holy day. And then He says the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath, right? So the Sabbath belongs to Jesus and He gave it to us. Then the Jewish feast, the Passover is called the Passover of the Jews, a feast of the Jews, the Passover, a feast of the Jews. The Jews, the Feast of Tabernacle, and the Jews, the Passover is Nayah. So the feasts that represented Christ's salvation were for the Jewish nation, right? Till Jesus came and fulfilled it. Till Jesus became the reality for that. Now, in conclusion, right, we have clearly gone through these texts, with all 8 texts and 9 texts that mention the first day of the week, and we find that not one of them even hints that Sunday is the Lord's. Do they even by any translation tell us that we are to keep it holy? That is the day to gather in church, or that we are to honor it in remembrance of the resurrection of Christ, right? Then we studied Revelation 1:10 and found no evidence that Sunday is the Lord's day, right? Because 23 times the Bible refers to the Sabbath as the Lord's. And not once does it call Sunday by its name, right? Both the Bible in both Testaments is clear. Exodus 28:11 states that the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord. Sabbath of the Lord. And Mark 2:27, Jesus tells us that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the Lord and the Sabbath is, right, is God. The Lord's day is the 7th-day Sabbath that John had his vision. Once again, remember the story of Aristotle? Aristotle was completely wrong, right? Because when you went and counted the legs of the spider, the legs had 8. He was not an insect, he was an. So Protestants pride themselves in the idea that they follow what the Bible says. But actually, if we follow what the Bible says, we must keep Sabbath, the Sabbath of the Lord, right? Our God, the Sabbath that was established as creation. The 7th-day Sabbath is what's holy, right? So let's close by reading the 4th commandment found in Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger, who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
So the primary reason, which includes all human beings, to remember the reason to keep Sabbath is because God is our creator. The reason to keep Sabbath is not because God delivered Israel from Egypt. That is a secondary reason for the Jews to keep the Sabbath, that He delivered them from Egypt. But the primary reason includes all human beings to remember that God is our creator. Okay, that's why we keep the 7-day Sabbath. So the Bible tells us that we are supposed to keep the Sabbath as the rest day that God established at creation and has never changed. And I trust that we, as we study, that I know we all 7-day Sabbath keepers here, but anyone else out there who will listen to our recording, if you are not a Sabbath keeper, I pray that you will be willing to obey, be obedient to God's counsel found clearly in His word.
I have a question.